Hello everyone, today we talk very generally about 13th century Bohemian history. For our historical region series, you know that for certain kingdoms we proceed usually century by century, at least for the later Middle Ages. And we already talked, of course, about 13th century Bohemia here and there. Just recently made a video that compared a bit this region with the neighboring Hungary and Poland. As you know, I wrote a master thesis back in the day about the Battle of Marchfeld, and so there was a big deal of Bohemian background there with Ottokar II and the power struggle that we will see now occurring within the kingdom, the role of the monarchy and the nobility, the towns, right? And especially the latter, Ottokar's reign being, as you know, essentially the most important part of medieval Bohemian history. I mean, this was essentially the peak of Bohemian power, right? That expanded over other countries, reaching up to the Adriatic Sea, founding on the Baltic the city of Königsberg, and more. So the 13th century, as you know, is a bit the peak of feudal chivalric culture. Bohemia was fully soaked in it as a feudal Central European country. It had, as a Slavic nation, the distinction of being part of the Holy Roman Empire with what was properly established as a kingdom within the Holy Roman Imperial hierarchy at the end of the 12th century, and which was further sanctioned together with an important sum of privileges, as we will see now at the beginning of the following. So a very important role, because this Western Slavic land, you have essentially the greatest monarchic accomplishment quite early on, right? Bohemia is admittedly smaller than Poland, so things were easier, right? You don't have enormous power struggles within the Bohemian crown lands as opposed to Poland, for example. You have at best this dichotomy, Bohemian Moravia, that are, however, always ruled by members of the same ancestral dynasty, right, of the Bohemian monarchy that are the Przemyslids. These, together with, in fact, the Polish Piasts, the Hungarian Arpads, are these, again, incredibly old, incredibly noble lineage that, especially in Bohemia, manages to secure essentially all the crown lands at this point. And in fact, most of the times you have on the Bohemian, let's say in Bohemia, Prague, that was the old time capital of the kingdom, and growing importantly together with actually lots of other towns. Ottokar II founded, for example, an awful lot of them. It would be very important also in Czech history later on. And this guy is either the father or the brother of the one who rules in Moravia, and that makes a bit of counter, let's say, a bit of resistance, a bit of opposition to, of course, the monarchic direction. There are, let's say, old-time enemies slash rivals, such as the Austrians in the south, the Hungarians in the southeast, the Poles as well, and the Germans that, of course, all represent a bit like the options of alliance, not just, of course, of conflict with for the Bohemian crown, that manages, especially the 13th century and the great Interregnum in Germany, etc., allow for an incredible amount, not just of consolidation, but also expansion in this very century. And things could have gone also differently in Central Europe, because practically with the decline, the extinction, the male extinction of the Hohenstaufen, Bohemia and the consequent fragmentation, of course, of Germany into the principalities, and more than else, the lack of a strong man at least until Rudolf of Habsburg, and fortunately for the Przemyslids, in fact, were factually the largest power in the empire, right? They were again, tidy, compact, solid monarchy that had also won a big deal, sort of not simple autonomy, but literally like aside from the duty of participating to the German Diet, like not owing much to the empire in the first place, because lots of stories we will be seeing now that had come with this sort of very ambiguous relation, right? But this was like a compact country, was large, like essentially regional in scope, and had the specific weight that could allow, albeit through careful dynastic rule, like when not law proper, able to accumulate all these territories that would come to include Austria, Steiermark, made videos about Styria, Austria, the same Moravia, so you can check those if you're interested. Of course, Carinthia, there is the Kraina, there is Slovenia, essentially the Vindicate Mark, even Friuli in northeastern Italy. And this direction is very interesting because it's all southwards from the Bohemian crown lands. Of course, these belong to other systems, right? To the German, to the Italic kingdoms, but they are accumulated dynastically and through also an important, set of military expeditions by Ottokar II specifically. So it's actually the glory, the prestige, the mystique, the epos of medieval Bohemia as a whole. Truthfully, Bohemia would become even more powerful in a greater sense, politically, spiritually even, in the times of Charles IV, right? Because Prague was truly the pumping heart of 14th century Europe in a broader cultural, legal setting, with the imperial court of the Luxembourgs was located there. Then the Hussite wars basically destroyed the country and basically gets obliterated and falls under the Habsburg. But let's say in the 14th century, there is already a big deal different things going on. First of all, the general crisis that Bohemia had also undergone before this, that is, after the defeat suffered at the end of the Habsburgs at Marchfeld, that with the death of Ottokar II, the same extinction of the Przemyslids a couple of generations later. And so this pattern emerges for the Central European monarchs that we discuss often comparatively in this key. We'll keep doing so, of essentially just being, witnessing a statal failure, right? And as a substitute, the emergence of just the oligarchies that turn these monarchies irreversibly into elective systems whereby the local sovereign is not much like the sort of historical ethnic strongman that, as we will see now, also for the 13th century had huge problems in asserting his power on the ethnic nobility of the country, and that basically bring to this further process of oligarchization, of privatization, that is practically the opposite of what is actually happening in Western Europe, that in fact takes off in a political and institutional sense in the later Middle Ages in very, very different ways. I made recently a video about, not so recently actually, it was last year, a video about the Bohemian crown lands in the Habsburgic dominion in the 16th century. So if you're interested, we have a number of things on Bohemia. If you're interested in Ottokar II, I made a video about his famous seal that is one of the most important depictions of, like, in that case, probably the Germanization of Western Slavic panoply. It's a beautiful knightly attire there. And so talking Bohemian history is always very interesting because it's somehow underrated, right? There's a bit of in internet culture, a mimification, of course, this sort of medieval Bohemian vibe that is definitely fascinating, but then the actual history, the actual details, the actual struggles are often skipped, and these videos are just introductory, but as you know, we do also more in-depth stuff. So we'll look at, there are just like a few rulers, like that they're easy to memorize throughout they are all the son one another, and they have actually pretty, especially Ottokar II, pretty eventful reigns, but also in the first part of the kingdom, like still this marked by this internal struggle, preservation, with a nobility that is getting ever more, in fact, fully feudalized in the Western sense, and so more powerful, more ambitious. And then a monarchy that equally tries to modernize, innovate, and therefore centralize and strengthen. And then you have all these international opportunities / threats that really help Bohemia. It is very, as we've said, compact, right? It's sort of all the Western Slavs, it's closer to civilization, gets the most the German Ostsiedlung influence, and therefore manages to stabilize earlier, right? It's smaller, but it's also sort of neatly geographically outlined. This all favors the stabilization of the system, differently from what was happening, say, in Poland, for example. It was always much more problematic, let's put it in this way. Now, the Bohemian monarchic attainment, I think, is a very important thing to start from, because before Premise Ottokar I, I think in Czech, I will be butchering some pronunciation, of course, but it should be Premise, something like that. And they usually attach at least historiographically speaking, it's not just about the Czech, it's also how it came to be in English. They attach the name of the dynasty before the name. Of course, here we're talking about Ottokar I, was the first, let's say, it was the ruler that obtained for good, right, for his crown, in fact, the crown, like the royal title, right? But he had not actually, we were in 1198, right, in Swabian times, they had not really been the first Bohemian rule to have enjoyed a royal title, except those achieved in the past by Bohemian sovereigns had not been hereditary, right? This was a thing going on among the Slavs historically, because, as you know, especially the Bohemians had been growing, like properly at the frontier with the empire, with this German interference and sort of also cooptation, etc. So there wasn't even originally some of these countries a real monarchic institution recognized. They had sort of more ancestral tribal titles, including the one of Rex, that could be in the Latin sense not really just an honorific title to define a certain aspects of the ruler's sacrality of success, and that, however, was not to be recognized down the country institutionally, right? And this had been the case of Vratislaus II, the son of Bratislaus I and Judith of Schweinfurt. And here, like, these guys were all descendants. You'll see now also they had married into the Hohenstaufen, but it was like the Czech-German relations have been quite intense. Well, this guy was the first king of Bohemia as of June the 15th, 1085, because he had been recognized, the royal title, by the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV as a lifetime honorific office, right? And this ambiguity of the early Bohemia, like within the empire, like differently from other countries that the Germans wanted to subsume, like Poland or even Hungary, right? This eventually succeeds for Bohemia, that enters to be fully a principality within the Holy Roman Empire. The other Bohemian ruler to have received the title of king had been Vladislaus II, or had been in fact Duke. This was the normal military title, the Duchy of Bohemia. In fact, I made a video about that period, that he had covered from 1140, and one of King of the same from 1158 until his abdication in 1173. Right, this made him the second Bohemian king, but after Wenceslaus II. But in either case, was the royal title hereditary. But it was important because it was a sort of progressed, so a precedent to that, and of course the monarchs were looking forward to be recognized as kings by the Holy Roman Emperors within this bigger system, and so the kingdom of Bohemia, as we intended properly, was established formally, institutionally, in 1198, when Ottokar I was recognized as king by Philip of Swabia, Philip II in his charters, the member of the House of the Hohenstaufen that was managed to be ruler of Germany from 1198 until his assassination. He had been elected king of the Romans as well, and this I made a video properly about the rise of Philip of Swabia and then of Otto of Brunswick. We've seen what kind of political shifts had occurred, right? The support of Ottokar I had been pivotal for Philip of Swabia being elected, in fact, king of the Romans. And this could happen because the Bohemians had opposed the Hohenstaufen's rival, that was the wealth Otto would become the Emperor Otto IV. Eventually, Philip was assassinated. Actually, Otto had nothing to do with that. There was just a private feud, and the assassin was eventually put down by the royal ministeriales sent by the same Otto later on. Of course, was not unhappy that his rival had been assassinated. It truly had nothing to do with that. And actually, this was an important shift within like the general situation, because the Bohemians had always supported the Hohenstaufen, right? They had been earning their the trust properly of this house. Generally speaking, they had supported whichever king had been in charge in Germany, mostly because if you look at it in perspective, like at least initially the Ottonians had thought. I also made a video about their Bohemian campaigns, like of Otto I, Otto II. That was sort of a routine, especially until the Slavs in the region weren't Christianized and stabilized. But and of course, like even the Christian ones would make some disturbances because they were sort of more raiding oriented. They that wasn't that strong power concentration locally. Actually, the Germans contributed to foster, exactly to stop, like to consolidate some ruler that would have enough control on the various clans. And then you have the Franconians and the Swabians that are on the other side of Germany compared to Bohemia, and that therefore are really seeking to consolidate the eastern border of the country, and so orientatively, in fact, the areas that were ruled by some opponents to their monarchy, often like trying to escape centrifugally this more southwestern control from the richer areas, and that in fact were more difficult to control. And the best way in this sense was boosting the Bohemians, because they weren't dangerous anymore in that destabilizing sense, to keep in check this more troublesome northeastern Germans. And this, of course, is very simplified because there were many loyal Hohenstaufen supporters also in the area, but orientatively, right? In fact, Bohemians being, even as not Germans, some playing that function, right? And so the Bohemians even sent troops. This was very complicated to do. It, as we'll see now, created all discontent among the same nobility that obliged eventually also in the conferring of the royal title to their ruler, like all a set of prerogatives, including not really sending military help outside of their country, which they didn't want to do. This was a problem already with the Germans when they had to send troops for the emperor to Italy. You can imagine for the Bohemians, but there were in fact Bohemian contingents also fighting in Italy in the Raumfahrt and more. So the formal establishment of the Bohemian kingdom under Ottokar I was a very important step further institutionally for the country within the Holy Roman Empire. In 1204, Ottokar's royal status was further accepted by Otto IV. There wasn't too much attrition at that point. They decided not to really go at one another, because at the end of the day, Otto IV was pursuing the same policy that in fact had promised the same pope not to pursue. So he was interested in Italy and all that essentially the Swabians had done. There's yet another proof that, of course, there weren't just, say, two Germanys that didn't care. Anyone who had the real power went for the Mediterranean. And the other powers were doing a bit of counterculture, because in the 19th century at least, there was this nationalistic idea that there was a northern Germany was more projected towards the Baltic and the colonization of the East, and that was the true would have been the true vocation of the Germans, and the Welfen opposed to the Hohenstaufen would have incarnated that. Well, Otto IV is the best example of how this was not really true. By the way, this further confirmation of the Bohemian royal title happens when Otto is still okay with the papacy, because he basically was elected with papal support in Germany against the promise of not doing what the Swabians wanted to do, that is to say not say yes, he would have descended in Italy as an emperor, but he would have not tried to take southern Italy, that, as you know, was at this point ruled by the young orphaned Frederick II. His uncle, as we've seen, had died, Philip, in Germany. His father, his parents had died, entrusting him to the same papacy. So lots of wars. This eventually brings to the Battle of Bouvines in Flanders. You know the story. We talked a lot about this, and we'll yet come back on it. And so in all this, as you understand, this is like a bit of a leitmotif in the Bohemian affairs. The Czechs are left alone, largely. They're not under pressure. They are actually subsidized with these prerogatives in order to simply consolidate locally. Not because even when it was a war in Bohemia, of course, Germany was engulfed by that, right? It disturbed very much the same trade. Bohemia was becoming ever more important especially in the east-west trade axis, but also north-south. And the Germans were expanding exactly along those axes towards the east. They did not like when the Bohemians fought against one another, and they wanted to stay peaceful there. By the way, Frederick II would recognize himself in turn, even before Bouvines and the final victory on Otto IV. This elevation of the Duchy of Bohemia to the kingdom status, this occurred in 1212 with the Golden Bull of Sicily, issued by Frederick in Basel, confirming just the royal title obtained by Ottokar I in 1198, but declaring him and his heirs kings of Bohemia. This came together with the proclamation of the Bohemian kingdom's independence within the Holy Roman Empire. This is incredibly important because, of course, there was a general sense of fealty, of obedience, of civility in all this, but Bohemia was recognized as just something on its own, something like another kingdom. In fact, it could not be ousted. in the process, just like the German, the Italian, the Burgundian crowns. And this would become the presupposition for later bolstering of such prerogatives, especially at the time of the Golden Bull of 1356, Charles IV. And I made multiple videos on the Golden Bull. At this point, Charles basically monopolized the Holy Roman Imperial institutional space and managed to properly fabricate some deals, to self-broker, let's put it in this way, some deals that would, for example, exclude the Habsburgs from electorate, things like that. This elicited some reactions, including the equal establishment of the Archduchy of Austria by Rudolf IV. And again, these are things that we've seen here and there in the videos about these lands that we will deepen further at some other point. So, incredibly important step, recognized thrice by royal authorities. Like even here, actually, it's not really a good sign for Germany, and consequently also for Bohemia, because these guys had been, as we've seen, fighting against one another. In 1212, the general situation in the empire had not been settled yet. But of course, Frederick emerges victorious, and he everything that he had legislated would be reconfirmed in his later reign. Now, under these terms, the Czech king was thus exempt, for example, from an important series of obligations to the Holy Roman Emperor. Except for, it was that like except for the participation in the imperial diets, and the imperial prerogative to ratify each Bohemian ruler that had existed up to that point, together with the one of appointment of the Bishop of Prague, was annulled. Right up to that point, the German emperor had acted a bit like the godfather of the situation. He had to give green light for whoever the Bohemians wanted to elect, and also appointing the Bishop of Prague. This thing ended because it was seen as too vexatory and too also unattainable at this point, because the same Frederick wouldn't intervene more than much. Like in Bohemian affairs, he had other issues to be thinking of. And so, as you understand here, there is all a tendency, a pattern towards the autonomization from one side of the Czech lands, but also the strengthening of the royal prerogatives in the same. Ottokar I's successor was his son, Wenceslaus I, called the One-Eyed, who would rule from 1230 to 1253. There were numbers of issues at this point, especially with Austria, right, that had gotten ever more restless. During his early reign, in fact, Wenceslaus faced threats from Frederick II, Duke of Austria. I just recently made a video about the Babenberg, even though not entering too much in the details of this, but we talked about their military organization and more. Because Frederick was expanding practically into Bohemian territory. There was always this frontier with Austria, was quite sort of unstable. Also, there was actually a tribal corner with Hungary as well. And these areas were becoming ever more powerful and habituated to clash against one another. Wenceslaus and other rulers were reluctant to provide troops to support for example, the emperor were fought against the Lombard League, right, citing concerns about their own territorial security in these circumstances with Austria. So when Frederick was fighting in Italy, he imposed an imperial ban on the Duke of Austria to essentially to stop harassing the Bohemians, at least as a measure of stabilization. So this led his homonymous Austrian duke into exile. And Wenceslaus and other princes also asked for imperial intervention in the situation. The Emperor Frederick eventually lifted the the ban on the Babenberg. This brought also to like new agreements with the Duke of Austria that allowed also the Bohemians to annex some territories north of the Danube. Wenceslaus allied with Otto II, Duke of Bavaria, and really distanced himself from the imperial policy in this regard. Also in 1246, he supported Henry Raspe, the Landgrave of Thuringia, in his election as anti-king, in fact, against Frederick II and his son Conrad IV of Germany. This is an interesting change in Bohemian policy because it sort of begins to highlight the interests that the crown like begins to pursue, like to enact particular measures of due to the power that the crown had accumulated by always supporting the Hohenstaufen. Naturally, this was not depending on some sort of scheme that they were planning for quite a while. It was very contingential to the situation, but it was evident, especially in the later phase of Frederick II's reign, that, say, the imperial involvement in Italy was sort of prioritary. That, of course, was an important presence in Germany. Like the Hohenstaufen didn't really collapse from a day to another. There were some things that were going bad already. And in fact, as you understand, the situation with anti-kings in Germany, the general revolt that had occurred also under Frederick's son Henry, were just by themselves showing how princes wanted their own space, right? And lots of things were falling apart so much that Saint Frederick II had to simply sell out public assets in Germany in exchange for money, right? For private power. Everybody here, there is the extinction of the Saint Babenberg at the Battle of the River Leith, that the last ruler of theirs is killed in combat against the Hungarians. And so there is this race for succession that will involve Wenceslaus' son, Ottokar, who will marry the last Gertrude, like the last heiress to the Babenberg, that according to the Austrian privilege that had elevated the country as a duchy from the one of Bavaria back in the day, there was also female inheritance. So this woman was very crucial, like in that particular situation. And everybody wanted to intervene. Like the Hohenstaufen wanted essentially a super southern German state that would control the Alps. So Swabia plus practically Austria would have been incredible. There were so many pretendants as far as Ruthenia that were backed by the Hungarians in that case for the Austrian succession and the Bohemians. So you understand that the fragmentation of German public power that had already gone on for a while, and the Bohemians did not simply want to remain like second in anything, given the particular power that had accumulated. There are interesting anecdotes in this. Wenceslaus I's sister was Agnes, that is famous for having lived a life of charity, mortification of the flesh, piety over, say, a luxurious and comfortable one. He wouldn't be really, beatified or canonized for over 700 years, but she was soon venerated already after her death that occurred in 1282. So the Bohemians here were, having their own saints in the royalty. That was a very important thing historically. There had been Saint Elizabeth of Hungary that had quite close connections with Thuringia, that had also been more or less on the same side of the Bohemians historically. This all added to the international prestige of the Bohemian ruling house, right? Agnes had even refused to marry the Holy Roman Emperor in the process, right? This at least earned her sort of sanctity, as opposed to like a Bohemian empress. And so, as you've seen, she was very devoted to her spiritual works. And corresponding with the Pope, she also established, quite interestingly, the first Bohemian monastic military order, as well as the only one ever founded by a woman, that is, the Knights of the Cross with the Red Star. Well, we're in 1233. As we will see, Bohemian kings were also in the Crusades, especially in the Baltic, for their own normal interest. As we've seen, they were not particularly adventurous towards the south or Mediterranean, unlike some others, like the Hungarians did so. The Germans were a bit everywhere in the sense, but they also sort of guided this broader Western Slavic effort towards the Baltic. I made multiple videos about the order of Dobrzhin. There are, you can check out the monastic military order playlist if you're interested. So this Knights of the Cross with the Red Star, we will, I don't know, I'm not sure how often we will talk about them, but it's an important distinction for the Kingdom of the Bohemia as properly the first military order on its own. It is not like Bohemia wouldn't have warrior monks already settled in some houses in the country. This was just the norm. There were already the Hospitallers from the 60s of the 12th century, roughly the Order of St. Lazarus. We talked about the latter, especially also in some sort of extra videos about the relatively lesser known monastic military orders. This had installed itself already from the late 12th century. Then you had the Teutonic Knights from, I think, like right at the beginning of the 13th century. They would stay until 1421. And the Templars that established themselves in Bohemia first in 1232 and would last there until basically when they were taken out in 1312. So you understand, this shows how international Bohemia was in this century, how sort of blossoming it was as a relatively fresh nation, especially for feudal standards, with lots of resources to exploit, a growing population, new towns being founded, again, increasing centrality in central, in European traffics, properly from the central position within the continent geographically. And this was indeed like the most dynamic century of the same premise-led reign over the country, right? There was a name, prestige, seen like a sense of relative grandeur of this monarchy, which accentuated, as we will see now, in the reign of premise Ottokar II. All this had been favored by Frederick II's preoccupation with Mediterranean affairs, the German dynastic struggles known as the Great Interregnum that lasted from 1254 to 1273, that are really like the greatest space for Bohemian expansion. Like, it was a great time saved and really put to good use, even though it was not really enough. This is also what history teaches you. You can do a lot of things well, not nearly everything well, but you can still lose it all in the end. Anyway, the most obvious picture here is the one of a weakness of the imperial authority in Central Europe. This was probably an eclipse in effective rule. We talked about Richard of Cornwall, of Alfonso the X of Castilla, made multiple videos on Interregnum, really, and we'll come back on them. Here the Germans started doing what we were saying before Central Europeans do. They call weak rulers, in this case from abroad, which was not very common for the Germans that historically had elected their own nationals to the throne. But this really highlights how sort of alienated from the necessity of a strong royal rule in Germany at this point the local princes really were. This was naturally it was not really the cataclysmic disaster that especially this tragedian narrative of the fall of the Hohenstaufen tells, but yes, it was a very negative period for the stability of the country. It was severe erosion, to say the least, of the already relatively few and difficultly achieved, especially, sense of public authority in a country like Germany. And essentially, the public rights were usurped violently by these various princes that sort of made everything much more violent, prompted other communities to simply associate, to put them, say, at least to stabilize partially certain provincial realities. And the Habsburgs that emerged from this, not yet securing the imperial title, that, as you know, will happen only from the mid-15th century, but actually having a very high, a very big power in this early phase until the beginning of the 14th century is often underrated, and especially in connection with Poland and Bohemia, not just, of course, like the southern German lands that they managed to strip, in fact, off from the Bohemians, but in general, like the power they also displayed in the Rhineland. I think like Rudolf of Habsburg destroyed as many as 70 castles there that had emerged because of the rebels. But that was not enough, right? Germany was further feudalizing, privatizing. Last winter I made a mini-series of 3 videos explaining like princely Germany as a whole, how the whole things worked from, say, 1250 to 1500, very, very much in outline. There was also another factor that helped Bohemia in this, partially, that are the Mongol invasions of starting from the 1220s to 1240s. As you know, the Mongols, we talked about these and say properly the invasion. Bohemia was crossed by the march of the Mongol army, but some areas went devastated. But generally speaking, the brunt of the Mongol onslaught was absorbed mostly by Poland and Hungary, that at this point were, as Bohemian eastern neighbors, therefore sensibly weakened, not therefore being able to interfere in Bohemian affairs. So Bohemia was definitely the country of the 3 that suffered the less. You know that after the Battle of Legnica, that was a bad blood of German and Polish knights, that there were some Bohemians arriving with royal reinforcement, and they hear of the disaster and they come back to Bohemia. That's kind of the mood. Of course, like Bohemia is fairly, say, exposed. It's the like as I always say, like there is not really like a frontier in Germany. In the east, like it already opens to some sort of steppe dimension. But Bohemia is also among the best sheltered. Poland will be invaded thrice by the Mongols. Hungary has, even just by itself, like a habit of using, as we will see now, also against the Bohemians, Kuman, nomads, etc. So Bohemia is actually the system that sort of maintains more stable foundation, more or less within the same model of German statehood, right? But the Mongols did arrive in Germany. They did arrive even in Italy, and so Bohemia saw that the nightmare with their own eyes. Just they were luckier than their eastern neighbors. And it is in this context that Ottokar II, the Iron and Golden King, right, comes to power. He reigned as King of Bohemia from 1253 until his death on the Marchfeld in battle. He is one of the greatest and also more tragic figures in Bohemian history. It's really, like in perspective, at least in terms of absolute power, the most important ruler aside from, again, Charles IV, but we explained how this occurs in two different contexts. This is probably like the moment of greatest booming of Bohemia as from a launch pad that could have and would, in fact, also gained at the country, at least temporarily, some very important assets. Right? We're talking here. Ottokar married thrice, but he marries Margaret of Babenberg. Here, like I skip the entire feud within also the heiresses of the Babenberg fortune, because they were again different of them backed by different powers. Ottokar will go at war for defending his wife's inheritance. Then eventually he divorces her. She was consistently older than him. In any case, he finally manages to become Duke of Austria, and he thereby acquired Upper Austria, Lower Austrian part of Styria. Again, I made videos both about Austria and Styria in detail for this series, so you can check those out. And he would essentially conquer the rest of Styria, most of Carinthia, and parts of Carniola. He was really, like, it's an enormous asset, right? He did so, by the way, in alliance with, at that point, the Guelph axis in Europe, namely Charles of Anjou, because of the, as we'll see now, the sort of the anti-Hohenstaufen legacy that he had inherited, as we were noticing before, from his father, but also to counter in fact, the Swabian one of the Count of Habsburg, that also would become king of the Romans and challenging Ottokar's rule, because he had become suddenly, as he say, it didn't happen overnight, but he got all these immense territories, made him truly the more powerful prince in Central Europe, as well as in Germany, by the way. And the relation with subjects is also very interesting. We will see it now in a while, or even right now, because first of all, Ottokar was very aware of the problem of the feudal nobility, right? At home, before rising to power, he had actually been elevated to would-be kingship, at least by the rebellious noblemen who had, in fact, risen against his father. So he actually found himself in the position of course, like playing along, and there was war because of this, and this revolved always around the prerogatives of the nobility, the fact that they didn't want the crown to become too centralizing, and so he initially sort of grew in this sort of party, even though he was likely, like, we don't know too much about him, about his psychology, etc., to understand what game he was playing, but he made peace with his father, who also associated him to the throne, which allowed him also to start, therefore, probably like under his parents' wing in this more, in fact, centralizing direction. He couldn't stand the nobility. He distrusted the Czechs, and that's also the reason why he heavily distrusted the ethnic nobility of his country, because he knew what they were capable of. He instead favored towns, right, the commoners. He founded lots of important towns, such as, for example, České Budějovice, and these were very important to fuel also logistically the royal army. The same was done in also more urbanized lands than Bohemia, and chiefly Austria, right, that in Vienna had the greatest logistical hub for supporting like Ottokar's expeditions in the Danubian Valley against the Hungarians, right? Where numerous battles fought there. Ottokar was a great knight, a great prince. He, incarnated the also physically he was apparently very good looking, very energetic, that kind of guy, so this ideal of the king that is still a warrior and is really that savage. There's a bit of Slavic hardcoreness there too, compared to at least the Germans, who were a bit more truly feudal. Like the Bohemians were fully feudalizing in this sense, but they had also lots of reminiscence of their ancestral tribal past. We'll more of that later. And you can argue that also the Germans were more open to, like, for example, the Mendicant orders, to a city world in a true, say, in a more modern secular sense. The Slavs were still sort of a slightly step behind. But Ottokar wanted to update the country with these tools that would favor him to sort of float over all these various estates and manage to reinforce his own figure. Like this cumulation again of lands all over Central Europe would become, dynastically, one of the old marks of these monarchies in the moment in which they were trying, in fact, to keep in check the local oligarchies, right? But of course, Ottokar needs a lot of money for his enterprises, and this, in fact, discontents particularly the nobility also of other countries, including the ministeriales of Austria, that were essentially the white majority, at least numerically, of the local knights. We talk about them often. Like, I have an entire series on the ministeriales, but in southern Germany, in countries like Austria, like, they were really the backbone of the local military. The Babenberg had created this envy of Central Europe in terms of the modernity of Austria, like a very well orderly administered feudal state. And Ottokar cashed it, trying to, thus from those bases, to affirm a more autocratic rule, right? So there was a lot of discontent. As we will see, he was probably killed by some people whose family he had persecuted because of that they had resisted to his rule, and all this stuff. His power, as we've seen before, arrived up to Italy, to places like the Patriarchy of Aquileia, places like Pordenone. He arrived up to the Adriatic Sea. And he campaigned, as we were saying before, as far as Prussia. On the Baltic, that was the due of, again, any great warrior king. There he defeated bloodily the pagan natives, and in 1256 he founded the city that at the time he named in Czech Kralovic, which in fact is the equivalent of Königsberg, the King's Mountain, that was obviously named after him. And this is Kaliningrad right today, so unfortunately enough, but there is all that beautiful history and past, which definitely is as old and rooted in Ottokar. In 1260, Ottokar defeated Bela IV of Hungary in the Battle of Kressenbrunn near the Morava River. This was one of the largest battles of the era. It's sort of underrated how big these clashes really were. These were something like that round, like regional force, 30,000 versus 30,000, which settled things for, not fully for good, but still in favor of the Bohemians in that front, which was a clamorous success. Also, the Battle of Marchfeld was the same size, and actually the largest battle of feudal knights, right, by number, likely ever fought. So imagine being actually young, right? He was born in 1233. So you are just at this point just 27, and you rule this enormous area that stretches from Austria to the Adriatic Sea. And you're so heavily involved internationally, you bear such a great name, and there is almost no one that can apparently stop you, because again, other countries are involved in their own other affairs. Germany is in crisis. Everything seems to go really the right direction. However, this is how unpredictable things can get. From 1273, the Interregnum ends, and the Habsburg king Rudolf begins to reassert imperial authority in Germany, which came, of course, together with checking Ottokar's power. Actually, the reason why the Interregnum ended, by some extent, is exactly this: that Germany was feeling threatened by Ottokar. The German princes did not want to have, again, any strong man anywhere, right, and were quite worried by this unprecedented level of power that basically anybody had ever gotten at that point within the same Germany by just personal collection of dynastically owned territories. And they elect, however, still this, what they called the Little Count of Habsburg, because really the Habsburgs weren't up to this point really anything relevant. And they were elected exactly for this, like having finally like some national king, but not giving him too much power, at least making him depend on them. Right. Rudolf was, however, an incredibly shrewd, skilled, and cold-blooded ruler, and he gets actually full support in a first war against Ottokar that was designed, except because there was all a tension rising. Ottokar was quite dismissive of Rudolf's power. This was elected literally king of the Romans, so the king of Bohemia was at that point to recognize such power, to revere him. Except again, this was the strongest king ever, the coolest guy, so powerful, etc. True king. The Habsburgs were just counted now, yes, kings of Germany, but just by that election. And so Ottokar did not want to simply bow down. This was, of course, altogether with very practical political reasons why he would do that, but there was this extra factor. Like Rudolf was an older man, but a very sort of morally upstanding one. He had received the papal support also in the against the same Ottokar. At some point, there is actually a crusade that is launched against. We don't know, unfortunately, well the details of this, but yes, there was properly like the idea that Ottokar was almost like a pagan king that wanted to perturb like the German order, and or just like the Roman one, because this is how the Germans call themselves. They are Romans, right? And they are essentially saying, as such, we are the rulers of the empire. This is like properly all phrasing, a propaganda that is running free among all the, for example, the ministeriales, also the Austrian nobility that hated Ottokar, right? It was actually a very sort of hotly contested situation where some coups that Rudolf managed to discover in time that Ottokar was regulating. And there is this scene, especially before things completely escalated, in which Rudolf received the submission of Ottokar just by feudal standards, like the king of Bohemia, like revering the king of the Romans, with Rudolf apparently just wearing a leather jerkin, and Ottokar instead having like the full, panoply, right, of the Premislid rulers in an incredibly magnificent way, and that was a bit like the actual picture of the wall, like also idealistically, propagandistically, that we get. So there is a first war in which basically Rudolf and also his son were famous for forced marches. He makes he uses a decoy. He sends an army next to Ega that eventually is like the gate to western Bohemia, and then instead he forced march to Vienna, and Ottokar gets bogged down along the way because also the communications kind of suck, and really Rudolf manages to seize Vienna. Actually, Ottokar's army arrived and he almost tries to attack Rudolf with his guard lowered, but there's nothing to do. Basically, all southeastern Germany passes to Rudolf, and Ottokar goes back to Bohemia, like steaming, of course, because of this. At that point, however, the German princes, that of course are jealous, take away all the support from Rudolf, who finds himself alone with this southeastern Germany that is not really particularly happy. Like for them, Ottokar or Rudolf there was barely any difference, except he was again at least the king of the Romans. He sort of was a German, and this anecdote of the election back in the day, Ottokar had tried, of course, to impose himself as like a figure in the empire, but there was no way he could get it. And Rudolf had just basically the local Austrian, Styrian, Carinthian forces and some elite Swabian knights that also thought of themselves to be like, they were actually pretty darn good. And they would fight in the last line at Marchfeld with Rudolf. And at that point, it's interesting to observe the problems that Ottokar had with the rebellious nobility in Bohemia, and especially Moravia, actually. Because we speak of the crown of Bohemia, of course, like it's two countries, essentially. The Vitigonen were a very powerful Slavic clan that during this first encounter in 1276 had where the German possessions were lost to Rudolf, had literally rebelled, allowing the Habsburg to succeed and creating problems in the rear, like Ottokar's logistics and everything. This Vitigonen would become the Rosenberg, right, family. This is one of the many examples of Germanization of the Slavs, especially at this higher level of, say, imperial political cooptation. These were powerful clans, but were powerful locally anyway. And as they grew within the Holy Roman Empire, as long as there were also so many Germans settling in Bohemia, also incentivized by Ottokar, like by the Slavic rulers that needed this, and it was an excellent card to use against the ethnic nobility, checking their power. They acquired these German names. So the final showdown again is the Battle of Marchfeld of 1278. Essentially, Ottokar invades Austria with the Bohemian, Moravian army, plus lots of German mercenaries, because he was such a magnificent king. There were lots of German knights who were fighting for him, mostly from places like Saxony, the northern Germany, that, as you know, had this rivalry going on with the south. So Rudolf was a southern German, a Swabian. You see this old thing of the Hohenstaufen's legacy that had fought against the Welfen of Saxony and Bavaria. Bavaria stays out of the thing, except the Swabian knights, instead of passing through the Alps like some other would do, not to cross the Bavarian lands. It technically was forbidden. Pass through Bavaria and kill randomly people. this kind of brutal furor of the Swabian knights. There are incidents that they arrive just in time to support Rudolf's army, That is also backed, however, by the king of Hungary that wants seeking revenge. This is the Kuman Ladislas that is called like that because his mother was a Kuman princess that the Hungarian king had married. And this battle is very interesting. Again, I wrote 200 pages long thesis on it. And at some point, again, I always tell you we'll make this video. There are interesting documents, like they are easily accessible. There's nothing that you can also really add really much to this battle from a strictly historical point of view. But we're told that Ottokar, for example, made leverage on the Polish, say the common Slavic ethos, like the identity, against the Germans when asking the Poles for help for reinforcements, aids. I said, we have to escape the snares of the Germans. We have this sort of older like thing of our ancestors, of our you can feel that more tribal, like more ancestral world in a way, as opposed to the German sources that are all about Romanity, feudal terms, Christianity. It's all about that essentially as a broader identity rather than some sort of hardcore ethnic German one because of the empire, right? In fact, the German battle cry at Marchfeld is, "Here is Rome." Like what you see here is Rome herself, right? And this is one of the single most beautiful thing ever. The battle is very interesting, but I'm not going to spoiler it. Most reconstructions you find around are wrong, by the way. Also on the internet, things are very, very actually much simpler than they seem. Like there are some YouTube videos that try to reconstruct it. It's terrible. In any case, there is not too much there about ethnic issues on the battlefield. The Hungarians, like they have all these steppe horse archers. They just basically bogged down the first line of the Bohemians and the Moravians that Ottokar, yes, has given the honor of the first line of battle, but knowing that they would be bogged down in that way, and so they practically lost. The Hungarians also don't break through because they're light, but they go plundering Ottokar's camp. The guy leads in the second battle with the Germans, right? He fights together with his German mercenaries. And he crushes the Austrians, essentially the Styrians, the Carinthians. In the second line, he goes on to attack Rudolf with the Swabians in the end. There is the major battle, and as you know, the battle is solved by a flank attack, right? Of the Ministerialis, Ulrich von Kapellen, sent by Rudolf, like doing this. I visited the battlefield, and I can't tell you, even without the sources being specific about it, where it exactly happened, because there is only one place, and it's beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful things. Like, it was a pilgrimage for me. It was a spiritual experience. You can read that field like an open book. It's one of the most beautiful things ever. Aside from the fact that the place is quite lovely, it's also part of a national park because there are some sort of river fauna. But I'm sure personally that it's full of actual Bohemian knights intact with all the panoply of the 13th century I can't say precisely where, under the riverbed. And if somebody paid there, they would surely find them. It would be one of the single most glamorous archaeological finds in the history of mankind. It would be beautiful. I wanted to contact someone to see if we could do something about it, but of course, it's always about finding the money for it. And underwater archaeology is pretty costly. Like, what do you do? By the way, you can't stop the river there. But aside from this, there are two, let's say, aspects of Ottokar's sort of payback in this. The first one is that he basically fights to the end while his line is broken, and the story goes that someone killed him after he had surrendered because this would have been an Austrian guy that had some relatives killed by Ottokar while he was ruling in Austria. Rudolf said that Ottokar had a gigantic soul. He recognized him as a hero. Unfortunately, his corpse was so scarred by all those who had wanted to insult him that it was decomposing so badly they couldn't preserve him. And so even though the wife got back the spoils, like nobody could really recognize him where he laid in state. Rudolf made the best to do that, because that was the best way to internationally recognize the fact that he had killed the guy that was of course dead. But there is almost this legend of like King Arthur, Frederick Barbarossa. By the way, Ottokar descended from Frederick Barbarossa. And this is also, like, this is how big of a guy he actually was. The other aspect is that nobody really knows for sure, because the sources are a bit vague, is the third battle line of the Bohemian army that would have been composed of the Poles. And some say that this third line practically fled the field, which kind of makes sense in the context, because once the best line of the king was done for, like, you just come back to Poland. That's hence. But some say that there were some Bohemians and Moravians there that had regrouped from the first battle, and that basically decided to abandon the king. Voices, but you find this explanation even in some, like, so frivolously, like, without proof in the, like, secondary sources, and that's also debatable. In any case, it's a hell of a battle, and Ottokar was also about to win it, but he dies, and Bohemia loses against all, because, by the way, the campaign is not over. As soon as the Bohemian army collapses, Rudolf marches into Bohemia because he wants to claim to be the protector of Ottokar's widow and children, actually. Talking the heir there to the Polish, to the Bohemian crown. And the Margrave of Brandenburg raises an army and enters Bohemia from the other side, and there is almost another major battle being fought, but the two armies agree to a situation of power sharing in Bohemia that lasts for some while. So basically, Bohemia is obliterated by this battle. So Rudolf naturally is a nobleman, and there is at this point, like, it's all about dynastic arrangements, and so what you can get of that, like the Ottokar's widow and children are protected by the Habsburgs. There are some marriages among them, the children of Rudolf as well, with the ones of Ottokar. This is kind of interesting. And Ottokar is succeeded on the Bohemian throne by, in fact, his son, King Wenceslaus II, who comes to age, and is also crowned King of Poland in 1300. Right? I will not digress excessively on this, but it's important to stress that, again, this thing of having different rulers on the same rulers on different thrones was really typical of this era. And Bohemia is fairly, like, it's not really a spent country, but of course has suffered a very heavy blow, and so for a while the Habsburgs actually have some sort of hegemony in the empire, until Adolf of Nassau, like also the assassination of Rudolf's heir and de facto successor Albert. That the assassination changed a lot in history, because at this point the Habsburgs had an immense power, like, unlike proportionally even up until like the Spanish marriage later on in the 15th century. So it's just like a phase that could have taken sort of different directions, and instead Albert dies. There is power back on there is filled by somebody else. In any case, that dreamed, of course, of a essentially a Bohemian, can't say empire, but something similar to it in Central Europe evaporates. Is rather the Habsburgs that take its place and secure Germany as a whole, but they also fail in turn at that point to sort of centralize, to repristinate sound royal power after the Interregnum. And so everything gets down to a princely scale of power that, in spite of the Swabian origin, in the Habsburgic case, will be in southeastern Germany instead. A bit like the Luxembourgs that are called to Bohemia later on when the dynasty extinguishes itself, and from Luxembourg, right? So even the westernmost, the French-speaking part of the empire. And in fact, this is how it ends. Like Wenceslaus II's son, eventually Wenceslaus III, is crowned King of Hungary a year later. This actually, in perspective, makes you feel like the kings of Bohemia ruled from Hungary to the Baltic Sea, but again, they were very much depending on the local nobility. And it's on this we'll look at the 14th century in a different video, because that's when the dynasty goes extinguished probably. But looking at overall at Bohemia in this period, we have appreciated in other episodes, of course, the importance of the large-scale German immigration that takes place in this century, probably the peak of it, and especially for a country so close to Germany and basically enveloped by it, because at this point, if you consider Lusatia, like Glogov, Olesnica, those are, Silesian territory, but in the south as well, like Bohemia especially is surrounded by the Duchy of Austria, like you have Saxony, Meissen, right? The Duchy of Teschen first, right? So it's properly enveloped by a sort of a broader German reality, considering also the fact that Bohemia is in the western part of the Crown lands, and so it's even more exposed to German culture, etc. There are anecdotes about the same Austrians imitating Czech mannerism at this point, and it's funny. The Premyslit kings often encouraged the Ostsiedlung, because this brought more updated, as we've seen, agricultural techniques, business models. This came also with probably German knights settled, and these were temporarily at least very loyal to the crown, because their presence, their dependent, their rights, their charters that on the German law depended on the king for their existence there, right? And this separated them from, at least juridically, which was essentially what mattered politically in terms of ethnic divide, from the rest of the population. Even though, again, they live pretty much in the same places, of course, especially in Bohemia, it's practically impossible to even say in certain areas what is German and what is Czech concretely. But the division, of course, overall does happen. Germans are mostly on the outskirts, right, and the Czechs are in the heart of the country. So the Germans populate towns, mining districts. Bohemia has a lot of mineral resources. In some cases, they go on, in fact, forming these veritable colonies. Also in the deeper hinterland, we find Stříbro, Kutná Hora, Německý Brod, that is in the vicinity of today Havlíčkův Brod. So these are all historical towns, just like, for example, Jihlava on the homonymous river, right? That started at least, to be that relevant as important German settlements. The Germans brought their own code of law that was known. Again, I made a video just recently about this. The Jus Teutonicum as a whole. Then, of course, there were different type of charters. There was Magdeburg's law, Hamburg's law, Lübeck's law, etc. That also varied. Like they could have that mold, that difference, but every charter was slightly different depending on the say, how it was contracted with the local authorities. This, in a sense, formed the basis for the later commercial law of Bohemian Moravia, because the Slavic hinterland was, generally speaking, less performing, less dynamic. Again, these were areas that had really never known the Roman urbanization and models that were in this sense exported from further west, and the nobility had been, even though these countries had taken sort of more to feudalize, what they had been relatively more oppressive on the population. They had prevented at least for these communes to emerge in parallel. In part because the country had evolved more slowly. Like in Germany, you have that is even not the single most dynamic of the Western countries, but it's at least witnessing an important growth in parallel, say, of communes with princely states, even though the former are basically bent to the latter, but they are. They find their space. They have greater expansion experience. And that's why they carry out this. They manage this. That the kings, the local noblemen, allow this officials basically to take care of the matter. That these receive particular privileges themselves, as essentially the local patriciate that run the towns. Of course, also marriages between Czech nobles and Germans became commonplace. The elite is always the most receptive in terms of international influences and possibility of being co-opted, establishing a longer range context for this purpose. As we were saying before, from the panoply of Ottokar II, as well as the one of other princes, also but the same region, like the famous, the appearance of Louis the Pious of Poland, killed at Legnica, we see this Western Slavs, really Slavic noblemen, really starting to use the most updated German arms and armor, being virtually indistinguishable from them. Same Germans have something overall that Central European that is common to the Slavs as well. For example, the eagle, the peacock plumes on the crests, the helmet crests. Those are very typical of the area and especially of the time here. But overall, especially Bohemia is definitely the single most Germanized of the Western Slavic monarchies, which is reflected evidently by the level of political and institutional integration of the country within the Holy Roman Empire, and as we've seen, de facto in this late 12th, early 13th century, probably the elevation of the country to that essentially peer status as a veritable kingdom within the Holy Roman Empire next to the other historical crowns of the same. So this is, of course, like always, an interesting time and place to cover. It has an inherent coherence, of course, like all history does, and there is always something new to learn. Of course, today's one was just like a broader introduction. We haven't gotten, as we've seen, properly even into the greatest details of the, say, I don't know, what king's policy is and all this stuff. There is all another part, other branches of the cycle that are dedicated to that. And how many videos about medieval Bohemia I made? I also don't want to create imbalances. I noticed that probably I made a lot about Bohemia. This is not so important compared to, for example, I made much less about Hungary. That is sort of a bigger system. It has, if you want, more things going on, and so it's unbalanced, right? But, if you, first of all, on Schwerpunkt, you know that if we don't cover something, we will do later. But, alright, so medieval Bohemia. Medieval Bohemia, because of course, it has actually a lot of views as a playlist, almost 2,000, compared at least to the average. And actually a lot, 21 videos. Well, I'm glad, because, I mean, some videos are relatively unspecific, but, you know, let's check Hungary. "15 videos, 360 views." Well, not of the entire videos of the playlist that, of course, contain many videos, but of the playlist itself. So this is interesting. Like, Bohemia is watched consistently more for some odd reason than Hungary. There is too few about Hungary, yes. In fact, I think the next one for Eastern Europe, like Central, let's say, Hungary is unframeable. It's Central Europe, let's say. But mostly because they separate Germany, put it a bit more like with the West, even though it's Central Europe. For the cycle of the regional series, never mind, these mental elucubrations. But you see that we need to talk about this as well. Let's just check Poland, because the Kingdom of Hungary in the 13th century is done already. And I think, yeah, and the Polish too. Poland for 17 videos, 437. Well, Bohemia is attracting much more views in that sense. And yes, we talk about medieval Poland. I think Poland, we didn't talk about the 15th century. We should talk more about the single chunks of Poland, which is sort of appropriate, because we'll end up doing that also for Hungary. But even though there is not this overwhelming much on it, telling the truth, at least I should make much greater research than the usual to make videos like these, because I like them. I like that sort of regionalism, and I like it to be appropriate. This is one of the best series, one of the most beloved series, the historical regional one, because look at place after place. Very well. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.